Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today, we're going to talk about this paper called A Whole Population Study of National Trends in Child Abuse and Neglect by Sex, Race, and Ethnicity in the United States. So what this paper looks at is who are the victims of child abuse in America, and from that we can infer who's causing child abuse in America, who the perpetrators are, because usually it's the parents. Not always, but often. Okay, the reason this paper matters is because child abuse obviously negatively impacts the child's development. So this paper looks at multiple different types of child abuse, including emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse. All of these have different effects, but ultimately it negatively impacts their psychological development. It impacts their mental health later in life. It impacts their physical health later in life. And it impacts their own social relationships. So when this child grows up, it impacts their likelihood of abusing their own kids or abusing other people or mistreating other people in society. So if we're going to improve the well-being of our society, we need to understand what are some of the causes of child abuse. That way we can mitigate those. Okay, it's also important to identify the demographics of child abuse. Who are the ones being abused? And more importantly, for our purposes, who are the ones doing the abusing? So like I said, more often than not, the perpetrator of child abuse is the parent or a close relative. And the reason it matters to figure out who's perpetrating this by like race, for example, is because American society has become very racialized in everything that it does. So, there's a lot of animosity toward white people on the part of all non-white ethnicities in the United States. And they tend to demonize white people. They're demanding policies of redistribution to take white people's wealth in the form of like affirmative action and things like that. Our countries, white countries, are being invaded by hostile outsiders who don't respect our country. They don't like us. They want to replace us. And a lot of white people, unfortunately, sort of have enough white guilt that they are letting this happen. In other words, a lot of white politicians, they don't care that white people are being replaced in America or in Europe, for example. And there's a lot of this sort of foolish idea of racial indifference, which is the idea that all races are equivalent and that the only differences are like social factors. And that's leading a lot of white people to be complacent with their own replacement. Okay. They're not as concerned as they should be about the fact that they are not going to exist in a few hundred years if things keep up the way they're going. Okay, so if we're going to preserve the white race, then ultimately what we need to do is argue that the white race, relative to other races, is high quality and valuable enough to keep. And so part of that argument involves making comparisons between races on all sorts of different metrics, whether it's comparisons of their genetic differences, comparisons of the intelligence differences, comparisons in health differences, or in this case, comparison of parental quality across races. So it's a little bit convoluted, but I think people are going to continue to see that race, the issue of race in America, is going to be one of the most important issues in the next century. So again, we need to start laying the ideological groundwork now for what I would call white preservationism, which is a set of arguments meant to stop mass immigration into America and other white nations by arguing that the white race is, again, you don't even have to go to like a white supremacist ideology. You just have to argue that there are genuine racial differences and that our race is good enough to justify its preservation. Okay. Which sadly enough, that's not accepted by default by people. Okay. So we're going to look at this paper. They start off by just giving some background on child maltreatment. First of all, they say that child maltreatment occurs at higher levels in the US than other North American and European countries. Again, we might see a little hint as to why that's the case when we start looking at the demographic breakdown of who commits child maltreatment. And they give a preview of that here. They say, within the US, racial and ethnic minority populations are disproportionately affected. As we'll see, they tend to blame this on the fact that they're a minority. But as we're going to see, there's at least one minority, namely Asians, that have lower rates of child maltreatment than whites. So it's not just the fact that they're a minority that's causing them to be, maybe stressed and therefore more likely to mistreat their children. There's some other components to it, evidently, by the fact that some minorities, again, at least Asians, have lower rates of child maltreatment. Okay, but they say There's evidence from several studies that Black, Hispanic, and Native American children are at greater risk of maltreatment experiences than their Asian and white peers. So the rate of maltreatment by most of these different metrics, as we're going to see, tends to go Blacks have the highest rate of maltreatment, then Hispanics, then Native Americans, then whites, then Asians. And they start to talk about some of the negative effects of maltreatment. So they say early maltreatment experiences are associated with a variety of negative physical and mental health outcomes. Again, that's pretty obvious, but you don't even have to take it into a super rigid academic angle. But, think about people who are treated poorly as children. They're going to grow up and they're going to be all these rude, dysfunctional people that we see in society. So I think we can all agree that our society's social fabric is deteriorating and people are angry, they're rude. One factor that we need to address is people's upbringing. So again, we want them to be raised in healthy conditions where there's limited abuse. Again, that's pretty obvious, but just so you understand the real world significance of this. Think about all the dysfunctional people you've known or seen in your life. Probably a large portion of them were mistreated as children. Okay? So it's sort of like a self-amplifying problem. So they say that collectively these findings suggest that greater exposure to child maltreatment experiences may place certain racial and ethnic minority groups at disproportionately increased risk of serious health conditions. Okay, so that's another reason this paper matters is a lot of minority groups, they have higher rates of most chronic diseases and other types of diseases. And one of the factors, first of all, they always blame this on white racism. They say that it's racism causing stress, causing these health outcomes. I've done some videos before sort of dispelling that idea by talking about genetic differences and differences in skin tone and vitamin D synthesis and things like that. But another explanation for why there are differences in health conditions by ethnicity is that there are differences in child maltreatment. And again, some of that might be genetic, some of it might be environmental, but the point is, you can hardly blame this on white racism unless you're going to make some very serious logical jumps. Okay, it might just be the case that these people have worse parents, and that's predisposing them to a lot of worse outcomes. So what this study did is they took a database, they looked at a database coming from Child Protective Services. So this database basically records the type of abuse a child experiences. It records their demographics, their race and gender. And then what this paper did is they looked at that across time also. So starting in 2012, all the way up to 2023, and looking to see how, not only who is being abused and by what types of abuse, but also how this is changing across time in America. Okay, well, we'll talk more about the methods as we get to the results, but we'll move on and look at some of their early findings. So first, just to explain the way that these tables are organized, let's just take this first row and column as an example. This is showing overall maltreatment. So this is basically all types of abuse linked together, combined into one. So again, they look at different subtypes of abuse also. There's emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. Those are the 4 types of abuse they look at. Up here, this is overall abuse, basically all of them combined. And then, again, they give the number here in this row. The number here is the rate of that particular attribute per 10,000 children. So, in other words, the overall maltreatment for both sexes combined, in 2012, there were 84.19 incidents per 10,000 children. Okay, in 2023, the rates were lower, only 71.78 overall instances of maltreatment per 10,000 children. All right, this AAPC, that's average annual percent change. We don't need to get too much into the details, but this is basically just showing how much it's changing across this study interval. So it's gone down. If it's a negative value, it's going down. If it's a positive value, it's going up. Okay, it's important that you understand the p-value. This is basically just an output of a statistical test where in order to see if this result is genuine, aka if this decrease is genuine or just like a chance result, scientists do statistical analyses. And all you need to know is that if the p-value that is spit out from these calculations is less than 0.05, it's statistically significant. So this is a genuine decrease because the 0.001 is less than 0.05. Okay. So over here with like the different segments, they split the study interval into 2 periods to see. And if you look just from 2012 to 2018, there's an increase in overall maltreatment, a slight increase. Whereas if you look in the study interval from 2018 to 2023, there's a pretty substantial decrease, making the overall change negative. Okay. Again, we don't really need to go into all of that for each of these. But if you look at, for example, the rest of the information here, females are more abused than males, and that was true in 2012 and still true in 2023. And then you could separate that based on different categories of abuse. So for example, emotional abuse levels are relatively low for both sexes, and it dropped going across time. Again, it's still higher for females than males in both time points. Okay, similar results for physical abuse, similar results for sexual abuse. Similar results for neglect. We're mostly interested in these results down here where they start to talk about the racial and demographic differences. Okay, so first in this second table, the first set of rows here is related to different types of maltreatment and abuse by race in 2012. Okay, so the way that you understand this table is they basically, this RR, that stands for relative risk. And basically, they set white people to a value of 1 as the default. And then they relativized everyone else to white people. So if the number for a given group is above 1, that means it's more than it is for white people. So for example, their first racial category or ethnic category is American Indian or Alaskan Native. And for overall maltreatment, again, this is referring to the kids, their relative risk of maltreatment is 1.14 times as high as it would be for white people. Okay, now you look at Asians, their relative risk for maltreatment is 0.29. So if it's below a value of 1, that means it's much lower than it would be for white people. Asian children have lower rates of overall maltreatment than white children. Now, if you look at blacks, theirs is 1.84. So they're 1.84 times more likely to be abused than white children. And if you look at children who are mixed race children, they're also more likely to be abused than white children. And now if we go across to the different columns, we can separate this based on different types of abuse. So again, remember the top column, that's basically Native Americans. They're much more likely to be emotionally abused than white children. Asians are much less likely to be emotionally abused than white children. Blacks are more likely to be emotionally abused. And interestingly, mixed race children are the most likely to be emotionally abused. If you look at physical abuse, this first, it's not significant. It's not significantly different from white people. So it's only 0.98, so it's very close to 1. And if you look at the p-value, it's greater than 0.05. So it's not a significant difference from white people. Asians have less physical abuse. Blacks have by far the most, much, much higher rates. So more than double the rates of white people. And then again, physical abuse for mixed race children is significantly higher than white children alone. Okay, so the sexual abuse column is interesting because while, for example, in emotional abuse, every race except for Asians has higher rates of emotional abuse than white children, sexual abuse, it isn't that way. So the Native Americans, they have lower likelihood of being sexually abused. Asians have lower likelihood of being sexually abused. Black children still have higher likelihood of being sexually abused. And mixed race children have lower rates of being sexually abused. So what this might reflect is the fact that perhaps white children are more likely to be sexually abused because people doing sexual abuse have a preference for white children. That's one possibility. So you got to keep in mind, if we're going to infer who the perpetrators are of these different types of abuse, okay, there should be racial commonality between the abused and the abuser for things like physical abuse, okay? Because it's the parents who are going to be the ones physically abusing their kids in most cases. Okay, nobody else is going to be hitting your kid. That would be very rare. Same with neglect. The people doing the neglecting are often the parents of the neglected. However, when it comes to sexual abuse, it's usually not the parent who is doing the sexual abuse, so it's somebody different. So there might not be racial commonality between abused and abuser in this case. The same might be true of emotional abuse. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, now we can go down and look at 2023. It basically shows the same story. We're not going to go through it all again, but the numbers change slightly compared to 2012, but the racial differences stay pretty much the same. So we're just going to skip ahead. The first two sets of rows were referring to confirmed cases of abuse, whereas these bottom two sets of rows are referred cases that were not proven. So we're not even going to really look at those. Okay, before we move on to the next table, I do want to point out that here they don't separate Hispanics. I'm assuming they're linked in with whites because a lot of studies link whites and Hispanics together for some reason. But we've seen earlier that Hispanics have higher rates of abuse than white children. So if they're being linked together here, that's potentially going to skew the white numbers up too high, which means all of these other numbers relative to whites would be much higher if you were to separate non-white Hispanics from white Hispanics. Okay, so the problem, these racial differences are likely even more exaggerated when you compare them to white children. Okay, if we look at this next table, this one looks at basically the change in maltreatment type across the study period. So again, if you look at the first row and column here, we have American Indians or Alaskan Natives. Their overall maltreatment in 2012 versus 2023. You can see there was a slight decrease. It wasn't significant. If you look at Asians, there was a significant decrease. If you look at blacks, there was just barely a significant decrease. Hispanics, now for some reason they do separate out Hispanics. There's a significant decrease. And if you look at mixed race children, there was a non-significant increase. So that's interesting. And then for whites, there was a significant decrease. Okay, now you can go through and look at each abuse type specifically and individually. I'll zoom out. We're not going to go through all that, but if you want to pause the video and look at these different values, you can. Okay, this is the second part of the same table. So again, we don't need to go through each individual type of abuse, but if you're interested, again, you can pause the video and look for yourself. All right, so now on to table 4. What this shows is basically the change in racial disparities across time. So again, we saw that most groups have higher rates of abuse compared to white children. This is looking at, does that disparity between race change over time? So basically, if the number is negative here, and there's a significant p-value of less than 0.05, what that means is that the racial disparity is decreasing. In other words, they're becoming more similar to whites. Okay, so what you can see is that American Indians or Alaskan Natives, there is not a significant decrease in the racial disparities. So they're not becoming more similar to whites. If you look at Asians, you can see that they have a highly negative value here and that it's statistically significant. So what that means is that there's a greater decrease in child abuse of Asian children than white children. Okay. Now, if you look at black children, there's a non-significant decrease in overall maltreatment. Okay, so there's not a decrease in the racial disparity going from 2012 to 2023. So the situation is not improving, at least not relative to whites, over that time span. What's very interesting is that if you look at mixed race children, they're becoming abused at a much higher rate than whites over this time interval. So there's a greater disparity growing between whites and this particular group. Now, again, you can look over at these different columns for the specific abuse types. So for example, black children, they experienced a significant decrease in emotional abuse relative to the decrease that whites experienced, but they experienced a very high increase in neglect relative to the change that whites experienced in that time interval. Okay, so you can, again, this top group is confirmed cases of abuse. This is referred cases of abuse. Here they stratify it more by gender, but we're going to skip that because, the trend is the same. Females are abused more than males. And this last table, again, it's all a comparison of males and females. So again, higher rates of abuse among female children compared to males, but we're not going to go too much more into that. We're going to skip down to their discussion where they talk about a couple main conclusions. They say, collectively, the current findings indicate that much remains to be done to reduce racial disparities in child maltreatment, particularly for Black children. So again, they're more abused than other children by every single metric, and they're not decreasing their abuse at the same pace that the other races are decreasing their abuse. They say, indeed, it is striking that this racial group with the greatest room for improvement in overall maltreatment, because they started off at the highest levels, saw none, while that with the least room for decline, Asians, experienced improvements. They try to explain this by appealing to poverty. They say poverty is strongly implicated in risk for child maltreatment. And their solution that they offer is government financial support and related policies for financially vulnerable families may yield dividends. So that's always what they come to in these types of papers. They always say at the end, okay, Black people do the worst. Let's take money from taxes, aka take money from white people who are the majority of the taxpayers, and give it to Black people to try and make it better. So that's always what happens. It's Black people do something bad, and the solution to that is take from white people and give to Black people. You're just perpetuating the problem. Okay, and remember, there was no improvement in Black people relative to the other groups over this time period. And that's significant because think of all the racial social change that has happened since that. Okay, we've given billions of dollars in diversity initiatives and affirmative action and race-based policies, and it evidently isn't yielding any results. So why do they want us to do more? Well, because the entire American political system is built around giving white people's money to non-whites who hate them. Okay, so terrible solution that they suggest. Okay, one other thing I wanted to mention before finishing this paper is you might be wondering why abuse decreased over time for most groups. They suggest that it might be due to a reporting issue associated with COVID. So it's unclear if there was actually a genuine decline over this time period or if it was just due to COVID and problematic reporting. But that's not really a major issue. The point is the racial comparisons. So that's all I really wanted to say with this paper. Again, like many different metrics, parenting quality, if we can infer anything about parenting quality from this paper by race, it's that Black people are most likely to mistreat their children, followed then by Hispanics, followed by mixed race children and Native American children, followed by whites, and then followed by Asians as the least. And again, the reason this paper matters is because we need to be defending our race from the constant attacks and from the idea that it is appropriate for us to be replaced. No, we're a great people and we deserve to persist and we deserve to maintain our homeland and we should be willing to fight for that. So thank you for listening.